I wasn't supposed to be in that classroom. That's the honest truth of it, and I figure if I'm going to tell this story, really tell it, not just the official version, I should start there. With the fact that I walked through the wrong door, sat down in the wrong seat, and ended up watching something that I still think about almost every night before I fall asleep. My name is Morrow Vane. I'm 23 years old, born on a transport vessel somewhere between Earth's orbit and the Cygnus Relay, which means I've never technically set foot on the planet most people call home. I grew up in the stations. Station 7, mostly. The big one. The one they built after the Accord, when humanity finally got its official seat at the galactic table. The one with the short legs and the wobbly surface that everyone pretends is perfectly equal to all the others. I was enrolled in the cross-species cultural integration program, which sounds impressive, which sounds like something you'd put on a resume and let people nod at approvingly. What it actually meant was that I spent 3 days a week in classrooms that smelled like recycled oxygen and alien metabolism, watching holographic presentations about species I'd been told were our allies, learning to keep my face neutral when something made my stomach turn. The class I stumbled into that morning was not mine. My session, Cultural History of the Voakai Hegemony, Level 2, was in room 14C, which was on the left side of the corridor. I went right. I'd been awake for 31 hours because our station's atmospheric recyclers had been cycling at high frequency all night, and that particular frequency had a way of making human sinuses feel like they were full of pressurized sand. I was not at my best. I pushed open the door marked 14D, found a seat near the back, and it wasn't until I'd already settled in, bag down, tablet half open, that I looked around and realized I didn't recognize a single face. Well, a single human face. There were maybe 40 students in the room. A dozen of them were human. The rest were a mix. I counted 3 Voakai, which you could identify by the way the light caught their secondary eye membranes. A cluster of what looked like Rakathi Exchange cadets in the far corner, their bioluminescent collar markings dimmed to the polite low glow that indicated they were in learning mode. And 2 beings near the front that I didn't recognize at all, tall and gray-white, with jointed necks that could swivel in directions that made my own neck ache just watching. At the front of the room stood an instructor I'd never seen before. She was Voakai, tall, silver-gray skin, 4-fingered hands that moved expressively when she talked. Her name, as I'd learned from the display board behind her, was Professor Elindra Voss. She taught Apex Biology, cross-species threat assessment. I had wandered into an entirely different department. I should have left, I know that. The rational thing, the organized thing, would have been to quietly gather my bag, slip back out into the corridor, and find room 14C before I missed the roll call. I had my tablet open. I could have checked the room assignment in seconds. Instead, something made me stay. I think it was the atmosphere. The tension in that room was already present when I walked in, though I didn't recognize it for what it was at first. It felt like the air before a storm, that particular charged stillness where everyone knows something is coming, but no one wants to be the first one to move. The students were all facing forward with an intensity that wasn't quite academic. The Rakathi cadets had their collar markings at a color I didn't know the meaning of, something between blue and gold. The Voakai students were perfectly, almost unnaturally still. Professor Voss tapped the projection panel at the front, and the room lights dimmed by 40%. Today, she said, in the standard galactic trade tongue that everyone in a cross-species facility has to speak, we will continue our analysis of predator behavior hierarchies as documented in the pre-Accord survey missions. Specifically, we are reviewing footage from the last comprehensive ecological survey of Class 1 apex organisms on 3 documented worlds. She paused, letting that land. I want to remind everyone that classification guidelines define a Class 1 apex as any organism that has no natural predator within its ecosystem, demonstrates active territorial dominance behaviors, and has been observed to kill not only for sustenance, but for competitive advantage or environmental control. These are not animals to anthropomorphize or minimize. These are the universe's finest products of evolutionary pressure. She pulled up a display, a rotating holographic model of something I didn't immediately recognize. 8 limbs, heavily armored exoskeleton. The kind of body that looked like evolution had decided subtlety was inefficient and simply built a moving fortress instead. The Krethak Cave Hunter, Voss said. Native to Mond 6, responsible for the complete extinction of 12 competing predator species over 3,000 years. It does not share an apex with anything on its world. It is the apex. She played footage. The cave hunter moving through what looked like an underground cavern system, fluid despite its mass, hunting something I never got a clear look at because the thermal camera struggled to keep up. When it made a kill, the room was very quiet. "Note the efficiency," Voss said. "No wasted motion, no prolonged pursuit. The organism has optimized over millennia." She moved to the next slide. The Vreth Skyslayer, native to the gas layer colony worlds of the Tharnes Belt, wingspan of 40 meters in juvenile specimens. Adults have been measured at 70, no confirmed maximum. It hunts in the upper atmospheric layer, diving at speeds that create sonic disruption before contact. More footage. This one I watched with my hands flat on the desk in front of me because something about the scale of the thing against the background of orange clouds made my depth perception go strange. It was too big. My brain kept trying to recalibrate and failing. The Rakathi cadets were murmuring something to each other in their own language. I heard the tone, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. "And finally," Voss said, and she paused in a way that felt deliberate, "we come to the primary subject of today's session." The display changed again. I recognized this one before she said anything. Not because I'd seen it before, but because somewhere deep in whatever part of the brain handles threat assessment, the old part, the part that doesn't speak in language, something activated. The footage was grainy at first, filtered through atmospheric interference, the kind of quality you get from a remote observation drone that's trying to stay undetected. Dense forest, green-brown and heavy, the kind where the canopy is so thick that the ground below exists in a permanent green-tinted dusk. Then movement. Something low, four-legged, moving between the trees with a patience that was almost meditative. Tawny coloring broken by shadow-dark stripes, heavy-shouldered. The head was large, and the eyes, when they caught the camera angle for just a moment, reflected the light back in a way that was both beautiful and deeply, instinctively wrong. "Panthera tigris," Voss said, and she said it in the original Earth Latin, which surprised me. "The Bengal tiger, native to the planet Earth, third world from the Sol star, one of what humans classify as their big cats, a grouping of large land predators of the family Felidae." She let the footage run. The tiger on screen had found something, prey, though the drone angle was bad and I couldn't make it out. What I could see was the patience, the absolute unnerving stillness that preceded the movement. And then the movement itself, which was so fast that the drone's tracking system actually lost it for a full second and a half before requiring. The sound the room made, or rather the absence of sound, was remarkable. "For context," Voss continued, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of an academic who knows they are presenting charged material, "this organism shares a planet with the species currently seated in this room with us. Homo sapiens, humans." And I felt it, the shift in attention, not dramatic, not a heads-turning all-at-once movie moment, just a gradual, subtle reorientation of bodies in seats, a slight change in the angle of secondary eye membranes, the Rakathi collar markings flickering briefly to that gold-blue again. They were looking at us. The human students, 12 of us scattered around that room, suddenly felt very visible in a way we hadn't 3 minutes ago. Voss advanced the footage. Different clips now archival, I could tell by the even older quality and the Earth calendar stamps at the bottom. A tiger in water, swimming, which I genuinely hadn't known they did. A tiger climbing into what looked like a large deciduous tree, moving through branches with the kind of confidence that should have been impossible for something that size. A tiger at night, the thermal imaging showing a heat signature that was enormous and constant. A body burning fuel at the rate of something permanently primed for action. "The Bengal tiger," Voss said, "masses between 100 and 300 kilograms. Maximum recorded speed on flat ground, approximately 50 kilometers per hour. Bite force, between 400 and 500 kilograms per square centimeter. Capable of killing prey significantly larger than itself. Has been observed dragging carcasses weighing more than its own body mass through dense terrain over extended distances." She clicked to a new slide, a comparison chart. I looked at it without fully processing what I was seeing for a moment, and then I did process it, and something interesting happened in my chest. a complicated mix of emotions that I'm still not sure how to name. The chart compared bite force, speed, sensory acuity, and territorial range for 5 apex predators. Krethak Cave Hunter, Vreth Skyslayer, 2 others I didn't recognize, and the Bengal tiger. In 3 of the 5 categories, the tiger was not at the top. In 2 of them, particularly the sensory category and the territorial range, it was listed in the middle. "Now," said Voss, and her tone shifted just slightly, the way a teacher's voice shifts when they're getting to the part of the lesson they find most interesting. "I want to draw your attention to this." She pulled up a new set of footage. Recent, I could tell the quality was modern, the drone work sophisticated. Earth again, but different, more structured. Deforested edges giving way to managed terrain with what looked like agricultural fields in the background. A tiger moving through scrubland at the edge of what was clearly a human settlement. Houses, roads, power lines. The tiger was not hiding. This footage was taken approximately 90 years ago, Voss said, by a human wildlife monitoring organization. The individual you are seeing is a known animal in a managed reserve. It has a name assigned by the humans monitoring it. It is wearing a tracking collar. She let that sit. "The organism you are looking at," she said, slowly and with full academic precision, "is one of the most efficient apex killing machines produced on the surface of that planet. And humans put a collar on it, not because they defeated it in combat, not because they engineered a solution to its physical advantages, but because a small group of them, over generations, learned to move quietly enough, approach carefully enough, administer sedatives efficiently enough, and the tigers, despite all biological advantage, do not consistently prevent this." The Voakai student to my left made a sound, very quiet, I couldn't tell what it meant. Voss continued, "The question I want us to sit with today is not why are tigers dangerous. We understand that. The question is something more interesting. On a world where this animal exists, where animals of similar or greater lethality exist across multiple ecosystems, what does it tell us about the species that also evolved there? I want to pause here in the telling of this and explain something. I've heard humans talk about the HFY framing, the humanity heck yeah school of interspecies comparison, the pride in species thing. I'm not that kind of person generally. I grew up in the stations, surrounded by a dozen different species, and what I mostly felt about humanity was a vague, complicated affection mixed with the particular embarrassment of being related to a species that had, historically, caused a truly spectacular amount of problems before figuring out how to behave around others. So when I say what I'm about to say, I want to be clear that I'm not saying it because I'm a flag-waving human exceptionalist. I'm saying it because it's what I witnessed, and because I think it matters. The girl in the 3rd row raised her hand. Her name, as I would learn afterward, was Senna Calloway. She was 20, a second-year cadet in the program, same program I'd wandered into by mistake, and she was from Earth. Actual Earth. Born in a small city in the southern part of a continent called Australia, which I mention because it becomes relevant. She was not remarkable to look at. Medium height, brown skin, dark hair pulled back with the practical efficiency of someone who doesn't spend time on it, wearing the same standard-issue cadet uniform as everyone else. She'd been quiet the whole class, quiet in the way that sometimes means bored and sometimes means thinking very hard, and you can't always tell which from the outside. When she raised her hand, Professor Voss acknowledged her with a slight tilt of the head. "Yes, cadet." "Calloway," Senna said, "I have a question, or actually it's more of a correction if that's okay." The room did not go immediately silent. It went through a brief intermediate stage, the shuffling, the slight reorientation, and then it went silent. Because students don't usually open with, "It's more of a correction." Voss's expression didn't change. "Please." Senna leaned forward slightly in her seat. She had a tablet in front of her and she glanced at it once, then didn't look at it again. "You said the tigers don't consistently prevent the collaring process," she said. "That the humans approach carefully, use sedatives, and the tigers don't consistently stop them, and you framed that as something interesting about humans, which it is. But I think the framing is missing some context." "Go on," said Voss. "Tigers kill approximately 100 humans per year on Earth," Senna said. "That's a rough historical average over the past century, adjusted for population density in overlap zones. 100 humans. Out of a current population of around 9 billion, that's, statistically, its noise. It's not even a rounding error. She paused. But the thing that I think is actually interesting, and I don't think it's in your dataset, is the other direction. How many tigers do humans kill? Not just through hunting, but through habitat loss, through development, through systematic population pressure. And not just tigers. If we're doing apex predator threat assessment, we should be looking at the actual numbers. Voss was very still. You're referring to extinction rates, Senna said. And near extinction, tigers, specifically Bengal tigers, dropped from an estimated 100,000 individuals to under 2,000 within a single human century. Not because humans fought them and won. Because humans moved in, changed the terrain, took the prey base, didn't even notice most of the time that they were doing it. The room was quiet in a particular way now, a listening way. The Krethak cave hunter, Senna continued, and now she did glance at her tablet, pulling up something. Eliminated 12 competing predator species over 3,000 years. That's the number you used, 12 species. 3,000 years. Humans have been responsible for the verified extinction of, I'm looking at this now, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 species in the last 500 years. Verified. The actual number is almost certainly higher. She set the tablet down. I'm not saying this to be, I'm not trying to be. She seemed to search for the word. I'm not making a point about pride. I'm making a point about the dataset. If you're doing apex predator threat assessment and you're showing footage of tigers to illustrate what an apex organism looks like, and there are humans in the room, she gestured briefly at the 12 of us scattered around, you might want to note that the apex status of the tiger on Earth is, at this point, largely theoretical. They exist in managed spaces, controlled territories. We humans, we restructured the planet, not to control the tigers specifically. We weren't even thinking about the tigers, mostly. We were just building things. There was a silence then that I can only describe as textural. It had weight to it. It had a specific quality that was different from the silence that comes from nothing being said. It was the silence of a room full of people recalibrating. The Vaokai student next to me was perfectly still. The Rakathi cadet's collar markings had gone to a color I had never seen before. Voss said after a moment, "You're from Australia." "Yes," Senna said. "Your continent has a particular history with this dynamic." "Yes," Senna said again. And then, with what I can only describe as the measured tone of someone being very careful, "I grew up in a country that has a dedicated government agency whose entire job is keeping endemic species from going extinct because of us. We have a whole bureaucracy of guilt. The Great Barrier Reef, the thylacine, the platypus. We spent generations either losing them or scrambling to keep them. I grew up knowing the names of things that are gone. It gives you a specific kind of perspective on what apex actually means." She paused. "I'm not saying humans are good. I'm saying the dataset should be complete." What happened after that was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. Voss didn't drop her pointer. Nobody started applauding. The Rakathi cadets didn't undergo a species-wide shift in philosophical alignment between one moment and the next. What happened was smaller and in some ways stranger. Voss looked at Senna Calloway for a long moment. Then she looked at her presentation. Then she turned back to the room and she said very quietly, "I would like to adjust the agenda for today's session." She pulled up new files, real-time database access, from the way the display shifted to live query mode. She put up raw numbers, not the curated ones from the prepared lesson, but bulk data from the Galactic Biodiversity Registry, pulling Earth classifications. The numbers were large. "The registry," Voss said, almost to herself, "lists Earth in Category 7 for Biodiversity Stress Index. Category 7 is the second highest category. Category 8 is assigned to worlds where biodiversity collapse has passed the threshold of no return." She looked at the class. "Earth is Category 7, she said, and has been since cycle 4380. The stressor species listed is Homo sapiens." She paused. "We teach the tigers as an example of what an apex predator looks like," she said slowly. "Perhaps we should be teaching what happens to apex predators when something more thorough moves in." I heard someone inhale somewhere in the room, short, sharp. Senna Calloway had gone back to looking at her tablet. She wasn't watching the room, wasn't watching the effect of what she'd said. She was making notes. And that somehow was the most striking thing of all. She hadn't done it for the effect. She hadn't calculated the impact. She'd raised her hand because the data was wrong, and she wanted the data to be right, and when the room recalibrated around her, she went back to her work. The session ran 90 minutes total. I sat in the wrong classroom for 90 minutes and missed my actual class entirely, and I cannot tell you whether that was a mistake. After the formal session ended, students began moving, gathering tablets, the normal dispersal. The Rakathi cadets stayed clustered, speaking quietly in their own language. Two of the Voakai students lingered, and one of them approached Professor Voss with what looked like a genuinely uncertain posture, which, for a Voakai, is notable because their default is carefully composed. I ended up near the door at the same time as Senna Calloway. I don't know exactly what made me speak. Sleep deprivation, maybe. Or just the accumulation of 90 minutes of watching something unfold that I wanted to understand better. "Hey," I said, that was something." She glanced at me. A brief assessment, the way you look at someone you don't know in an enclosed space. "The numbers aren't even the wildest part," she said. "What's the wildest part?" She pushed the door open, and we moved into the corridor together without exactly deciding to. "The wildest part," she said, "is that we know, we know what we've done, we have the records. We wrote them down ourselves, cataloged everything, measured the damage, built the guilt infrastructure, the protected areas and the rewilding programs and the species recovery funds. We know. And we keep going anyway, mostly because the system is bigger than the knowledge. And that," she paused, and I thought she was going to say something harsh, but what she actually said was quiet and complicated. "That's not something a Krethak cave hunter can do. Know what it is and feel complicated about it." She said it without triumph, without pride. She said it the way you say a thing that is true and heavy. "We're the only apex predator that keeps a ledger," she said. "That's worth noting." She turned and walked down the corridor, and I watched her go, and the recycled oxygen in the station felt, for a moment, different somehow. A little heavier. A little more like something I was responsible for. I found out later what the Rakathi cadets had been saying to each other during the session. I have a friend, Tiv, fourth-year dual-species household, who grew up speaking Rakathi as a first language. I described the color of the collar markings I'd seen, and she went quiet for a moment. "That's the color they use," she said, "when they've encountered new information that changes a prior threat assessment." "Threat assessment," I repeated. "Not hostile threat," she clarified quickly. "It's not the aggressive reading. It's more like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize it's bigger than the doorway suggested, bigger than you thought from outside." She paused. "They were recalibrating," she said. "They were recalibrating their assessment of humans." I've thought about that a lot, the particular color of the collar markings, the feeling of walking through a door and finding more room than you expected. We live in stations built on the edge of space, in corridors that smell like recycled air, in classrooms where 40 different bodies breathe different chemical compositions of atmosphere and sit in chairs designed for forms we don't share. We are newcomers at a table we didn't set, in a room we didn't build, with rules we're still learning. And somewhere in the corner of this story, a girl from Australia raised her hand and said the dataset is incomplete, and the room went quiet in a specific way that had a specific texture. Not because she said something frightening, because she said something true. End of part 1. 3 days after I walked through the wrong door, I was summoned. Not dramatically, not by uniformed officials or flashing comms. Just a message on my tablet from the administrative office of the Cross-Species Cultural Integration Program asking me to come in for an academic review session at 900 the following morning. Tone neutral, header formal. The kind of message that, if you've spent any time in institutional environments, you know can mean a dozen different things, only 2 of which are actually fine. I showed up, of course I showed up. The office was on the upper tier of the educational block, which meant a 15-minute vertical transit that gave me entirely too much time to think about what I might have done wrong by sitting in the wrong classroom for 90 minutes, and then writing, in my personal log that evening, approximately 4,000 words about what I'd watched. What I didn't know, walking into that office, was that Senna Calloway was already there. She was sitting in a chair across from a wide desk, in the same practical posture she'd occupied during the class, upright, tablet in her lap, not performing relaxation she didn't feel. The person behind the desk was someone I recognized from orientation. Administrator Fenn, a Vokai who'd been at Station 7 for longer than the station's current iteration, and who had a reputation for being quietly, precisely decisive. Beside Fenn, which surprised me, was a Rakathi, not a cadet, an adult in the formal banding that indicated an observer class function, someone who watched and assessed and reported. The collar markings were muted in professional mode, revealing nothing. I sat down in the chair next to Senna without being told to. She glanced at me sideways. "I wondered if they'd call you," she said, very quiet. "Why? You were watching very carefully," she said. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. Fenn began without preamble, which was typical for Vokai. They consider pre-conversational warmth inefficient. "Cadet Calloway, you are here because what occurred 3 days ago in Professor Voss's classroom has been flagged for review by the Interspecies Academic Committee. This is not a disciplinary review. The flag is marked positive interest." Senna's expression didn't change much. "Okay." "Cadet Vane," Fenn looked at me. "You are here because your personal log entry from that evening was automatically flagged by the station's behavioral analysis system. The entry referenced the incident and contained analysis that the committee found relevant." I thought about the 4,000 words I'd written while running on no sleep and the adrenaline of something I couldn't quite name, and I felt something in my chest that was approximately 90% anxiety and 10% something else. "Relevant how?" I said. Fenn folded their four-fingered hands on the desk. "The committee is conducting an ongoing assessment of cross-species educational standards," Fenn said. "Specifically, they are reviewing the curriculum used in apex predator classification courses, which are taught in 17 educational institutions across the station network. The incident in Professor Voss's classroom was not anticipated. But it is, it seems, directly applicable to the review in progress." The Rakathi observer still said nothing. The collar markings remained carefully neutral. "What we would like," Fenn said, "is for both of you to speak with the committee, informally, to describe what occurred." Senna looked at me, I looked at her. "Together," she said. "Together," Fenn confirmed. The committee session was held 2 days later, in a room that was clearly designed to communicate gravity without quite crossing into intimidation. High ceilings, indirect lighting, a table that was genuinely circular rather than the kind that pretends to be circular while having one end that is obviously the primary position. There were 11 committee members. 6 Vokai, 2 Rakathi, one being from the gray-white species I'd seen in the classroom and still didn't know the name of, and 2 humans. The humans I recognized: Dr. Amara Solis, who ran the Human Cultural Liaison Office, and a man I'd seen in administrative areas but hadn't been formally introduced to, Dr. Fenn Nakamura, who turned out to be the head of the Cross-Species Education Standards Working Group. Senna and I sat side by side at the table. We'd spoken twice in the 2 days between the summons and the session, once in the commissary for about 20 minutes, once over comms for about an hour, and I'd come to understand, over those conversations, that she was one of those people who thinks about everything twice before saying it once, and when she speaks, the architecture underneath what she's saying is usually more complicated than the surface suggests. The committee asked me first, which made sense. I was the witness, the outside perspective. I told it the way I'm telling it now, walked through the wrong door, sat in the wrong seat, watched the footage, watched the room watch the footage, watched Senna raise her hand. When I got to the part about what she said, Dr. Solis leaned forward slightly. "Can you characterize the room's reaction?" she asked, "as specifically as you can." I thought about it. "It was quiet," I said, "but not the quiet of an empty room. It was the quiet of a room full of people all doing something privately at the same moment. Recalibrating. I think that's the right word. Everyone was recalibrating." "The non-human students specifically," said one of the Vokai committee members, a woman named Idris Vel, whose function I later learned was interspecies behavioral analysis. "What did you observe?" "The Rakathi cadets' collar markings changed color," I said. "I didn't know what it meant at the time. Someone explained it to me afterward, the color for recalibrating a threat assessment, and the Vokai students were still, not in a frozen way. More like the stillness of attention, of paying attention very hard." Vel made a note. Then it was Senna's turn. She described the class from her perspective. She'd been enrolled correctly, had been in the room since the beginning, had been following the presentation and its data. When the tiger footage came up, she'd started running numbers on her tablet. She hadn't planned to speak. "What made you decide to raise your hand?" Dr. Nakamura asked. Senna thought about this for a moment. "The framing was wrong," she said. "Not maliciously wrong. Not, I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing Professor Voss's preparation. The course is called Apex Biology, Cross-Species Threat Assessment, and the dataset for that course had the tiger as an apex predator, which it is biologically. Ecologically, in isolation, but in context, in the current context of what Earth actually is, presenting the tiger as an apex without noting what has happened to apex predators on Earth, since humans industrialized, is the equivalent of showing historical footage of a great empire, and not mentioning that it fell. You're teaching something that is technically true and contextually incomplete." "And that bothered you?" Vel said, not a question. "The incomplete dataset bothered me," Senna said. "Yes. Because—" Senna was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I wrote down afterward verbatim because I didn't want to misremember it. "Because we're in classrooms with species who are forming their working understanding of humanity right now. Their framework. The thing they'll use to make decisions about us, what we're capable of, what we're like, what to expect. And if the framework is built on incomplete data, the decisions made with it will be incorrect, and we'll be the ones living inside those incorrect decisions." The committee discussed for 3 days. Senna and I were not in those sessions, obviously. What came back to us, through Fenn, through Dr. Solis, through the formal summary document that landed in both our inboxes on cycle 4417.96, was this. The committee was recommending a curriculum revision for all Apex biology courses in the station network. The revision would add a module, Ecological Impact of Homo sapiens, the Apex variable. It would use the same datasets that Senna had cited in the classroom, sourced directly from the Galactic Biodiversity Registry and the Earth Conservation Archive, both publicly accessible. The recommendation also included something else. A note, appended by the Rakathi observer who had sat silently through the initial meeting. I want to reproduce it as accurately as I can from the formal summary, rewording slightly to avoid direct quotation. The observer had noted that the incident represented a specific category of interspecies communication that Rakathi taxonomists call Sovareka, which translates roughly as the correction that changes the map. In Rakathi academic tradition, a Sovareka event carries particular weight. It marks the moment when a prior understanding is formally revised by new information, and the revised understanding takes precedence over the original in all future applications. The observer's note stated that, in its assessment, the incident in Professor Voss's classroom constituted a legitimate Sovareka event for the 12 or more non-human students present, that their working map of humanity had been revised, and that the revision had been initiated not by an authority, not by a human administrator or diplomatic representative or officially designated cultural liaison, but by a 20-year-old cadet from Australia who had glanced at a dataset and found it lacking. The note concluded with something I read 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly. It said, "The observed behavior pattern, the correction of incomplete information in a communal academic setting, without authorization, without hierarchy, from a position of relative social smallness, is not typical of species at early galactic integration stages. Most species at this stage defer. They do not correct. The willingness to correct, and the specific manner of the correction, measured, evidenced, non-aggressive, is a data point that warrants inclusion in ongoing behavioral assessments of the species." I read that 3 times. The willingness to correct. Most species at this stage defer. I want to tell you what happened next, but first I need to tell you about something that happened in between, because it's the part of this account that I think is most important to include. The day after the committee summary arrived, I found Senna in the station's observation lounge. It's the big one on the outer ring, where the viewport is wide enough that you can see the full arc of the station's structure curving away from you, and beyond it, depending on the rotation, either deep black space or the pale blue-white light of the transit corridor. She was sitting with her back to the viewport, which struck me as unusual. Most people sit facing it. I sat down across from her. "Have you read the committee summary?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "The Rakathi Observer's note," I said. "Yes. What do you think about it?" She looked at me. She had a cup of something hot. I don't know what, one of the non-caffeinated station blends that the nutritional system generates to approximate the comfort beverages of various species. She wrapped both hands around it. "I think it's kind," she said. "The framing is kind, the Sovareka thing, the correction that changes the map. It's a respectful framing." But I raised my hand because the data was wrong," she said. "That's it. I wasn't performing cultural diplomacy. I wasn't making a calculated statement about human capability. I looked at the dataset and it was missing significant variables. And I've been trained. I've been raised, actually, by a mother who spent 30 years in ecological restoration, to not let a missing variable slide when the missing variable matters." She paused. "The Rakathi Observer's note says the willingness to correct is notable, that most species defer. And I'm not disagreeing with them. I don't know enough about other species at integration stage to argue the point. But from inside, it didn't feel like bravery. It felt like the data was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and sitting on that felt worse than saying something." "That might be what bravery feels like from inside," I said. She considered this. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it's just the particular shape that's been trained into us by living on a planet where ignoring the data has historically produced catastrophic results. We've run the experiment of not raising our hand. We know what that produces. It produces empty forests and bleached reefs and files full of names of things that used to exist." She looked down at her cup. "The ledger," she said, almost to herself. "We're the apex predator that keeps a ledger." I remembered her saying that in the corridor 3 days earlier. "Do you think it matters," I asked, "for how the other species see us?" She thought about it for a long time. "I think," she said carefully, "that we have spent a lot of energy since the Accord trying to demonstrate to the galactic community that we are safe. Manageable, that we've grown up, and that's real work and it matters, and I'm not dismissing it. But I think the thing that happened in that classroom was something different. It wasn't us saying we've learned our lesson. It was the lesson appearing in the data itself, the number of species lost, the Category 7 rating, the tigers in their managed reserves. The story is in the numbers, and the numbers are ours. We made them. We measured them ourselves." She looked up. "We keep the ledger," she said again. "And when someone reads the ledger wrong or reads an incomplete page, we say so. Not because it makes us look good, the ledger doesn't make us look good. Because the ledger is accurate, and accuracy matters more than looking good." She put down the cup. "I think that might be worth something," she said, "to species who are deciding what we are." 6 weeks after the incident, Professor Voss requested a meeting with both of us. Not administrative, not official. She sent the request through personal channels, a note that said, simply, "I have been revising. I would like to speak with you both if you're willing." We met in her office, which was a small room lined with biological specimen displays, actual physical specimens preserved behind glass, labeled in Vorkai script with small translations underneath in trade tongue. I looked at them while we waited for her to finish a calm call. A Vreth Skyslayer feather, enormous, iridescent. A fragment of Krethak cave hunter exoskeleton. A pressed specimen of something that looked like a deep-sea earth organism, flat and strange, preserved in blue-tinted gel. She sat across from us, and she said without preamble, "I have been teaching Apex biology for 11 years. In that time, the curriculum has remained substantively unchanged. I have shown the tiger footage in every session. I have presented the comparative chart in every session. And in 11 years, no student has," she paused, choosing words carefully, "has engaged with the contextual gap the way you did." "I assumed someone must have," Senna said. "No," said Voss. "I reviewed the session records. No student has raised the extinction rate question. No student has inverted the predator-prey framing. I have non-human students who have taken this course, and then, years later, gone on to work in human liaison roles, and they carried the incomplete framework I gave them. The weight of that in the room was particular. I am revising the course," Voss said. "Not because the committee recommended it, though they did. Because you were right and I should have seen the gap myself. I had the data. The registry data is publicly accessible. I simply did not look at it from that direction. She looked at Senna directly. May I ask you something? Yes, Senna said. When you said that humans are the only apex predator that keeps a ledger, and I understand you said this outside the classroom, but it has been reported, and I have thought about it. What did you mean by the ledger specifically? You meant the extinction records. I meant all of it, Senna said. The extinction records, the pollution monitoring, the climate measurements we started taking 150 years before we acted on them. We measured it for a century and a half before we changed behavior. We knew. We wrote it down. We had the data. And that's almost more interesting than if we hadn't known from a behavioral standpoint, because it means the knowledge and the behavior aren't the same system. They're different systems that can operate independently. She paused. The ledger, she said, is the knowledge system. It's the part of us that measures, and it kept running even when the behavior system wasn't listening. That's what I mean. The measurement never stopped. Even at the worst of it, we were measuring, recording, publishing, archiving, which means that when we decided to use the data, when the behavior system finally synchronized with the knowledge system, the data was all there. We hadn't lost it. We'd been keeping it. Voss was very still. That is, she said slowly, a remarkably generous interpretation of a deeply destructive period. I know, Senna said. I carry the other interpretation too. My mom spent 30 years trying to restore coastal wetlands that humans destroyed in 30, so I know what the balance sheet looks like. I'm not saying the ledger makes it okay. I'm saying the ledger is interesting. It's what makes us something other than just the worst version of what we've been. I am not a philosopher. I want to be clear about that. I am a 23-year-old cadet who walked through the wrong door and ended up watching something I didn't expect, and then tried to write it down as honestly as I could because it felt like the kind of thing that deserved to be written down. But in the weeks after the committee, after the meeting with Voss, after several more conversations with Senna, and with Tiv, and with various people across various departments who'd heard about what happened and wanted to talk about it, I found myself coming back, again and again, to a particular question. Not what does this mean about humans? That question had too many answers and too many speakers already. The question I kept coming back to was simpler. What does it feel like from inside to be the thing the dataset missed? Because that's what we were in that classroom. We were the variable that the dataset hadn't fully included. The tiger footage played, and the implicit message of the footage was, here is an apex predator. And the 12 humans scattered around the room were, by implication, by biological classification, by the structure of the lesson itself, the soft mammals who share a world with this magnificent, optimized killer. Except that framing was 40 years out of date at minimum. Except that the tigers were in managed reserves and the humans were the managers. Except that the dataset, if you ran it correctly, showed something more complicated and more troubling, and depending on how you looked at it, more interesting. We were in the room when the footage played. And we didn't know what we looked like from outside until Senna Calloway ran the numbers and said, the dataset is incomplete. Here is the last thing I want to include, and then I will close this account. On the day I submitted the first section of this testimony, I received a message from a Rekathi cadet whose name I will render as Shivanres in trade tongue transliteration. They had been in the classroom that day, one of the cluster in the far corner whose collar markings I had watched change color. The message was written in formal trade tongue, carefully composed. They asked if I would be willing to answer some questions for a paper they were writing for a Rekathi academic audience about cross-species educational encounters and the Sovareka phenomenon. I said yes. The first question they asked me was, from your perspective, did the human cadet understand the significance of what she was doing when she raised her hand? I thought about Senna's face in the observation lounge, the cup of something warm in her hands, the flat, practical tone in which she'd said, the data was wrong and sitting on that felt worse than saying something. I wrote back, I believe she understood that the data was incomplete and needed to be corrected. I believe she understood this was a public act with a public effect. I do not believe she understood in that moment that it would be significant beyond the classroom. She raised her hand because the numbers were off. The significance came from outside, from what the room did with the correction. Shivanres replied within the hour. That is, they wrote, what makes it notable. Many species would raise their hand only if they understood the significance and had calculated the outcome. The willingness to correct in the absence of that calculation, because the data matters, independent of the social outcome, is the specific characteristic that is worth examining. I read that message several times. Then I added it to my personal log, under a heading I'd started writing that first night, after the wrong classroom and the right lesson, and the particular silence of a room full of beings learning something they hadn't expected to learn. The heading was simple, just 4 words. The ledger keeps running. The apex predator footage played in class that day. And then the human girl raised her hand. And the room remembered what it had, somehow, forgotten to include in the data. We are not safe, we are not uncomplicated. We do not have clean hands, and we are not building toward a clean legacy. The ledger of what we have done to the living world we came from is long and dark and detailed, because we wrote it ourselves, with extraordinary precision. But we wrote it. We measured it all and we wrote it down. And when the record was incomplete, one of us said so. In the end, that might not be enough. But it is, at minimum, a start.